Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here in West Michigan. As Maria said, I'm JP DeGance, the founder and president of Communio. We are that nonprofit that equips the local church to evangelize through a renewal of healthy relationships, marriage, and the family. Now, I know that can sometimes lead folks to believe that makes me a marriage expert. And I know nobody would be more surprised to learn that than my wife, who is at home right now watching this with our 8 kids. And so kids afterwards, make sure to listen to your mom and go to bed. So that said, what I'm going to share with you tonight is actually the findings of a new study that we've just published called the Nationwide Study for Faith and Relationships. And we just went through this at the Colson Center's National Conference, and I'm excited to share a lot of the findings with you. It builds on the research that is in the book I co-authored with John Van Epp, Endgame, the Church's Strategic Move to Save Faith and Family in America. And I think some of the findings won't surprise you, and I think some of the findings will very much surprise you. So we'll jump into it. Now, I know there was in the news recently, May 3rd, the U.S. Surgeon General issued and reissued an advisory on an epidemic of loneliness. Maybe you guys have heard about this. This has been ongoing. Mother Teresa actually talked about it in 2004 and said that loneliness was the leprosy of the West, and it was worse than the poor of Calcutta. Now, since that time, it is only expanded, right? The United Kingdom has created a cabinet-level minister for loneliness because of how much it impacts public health outcomes, right? In the United States, if you're found to be considered lonely, it shortens your lifespan by 15 years. Okay, it's the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So we should deeply care about the spread of loneliness. Now, some of you, when you hear about this epidemic, we might immediately think, well, this must be a real problem with the elderly. In fact, I was looking at a story in the Washington Post, and everybody they were interviewing were elderly people. Okay, while sure that can be a problem, the real explosive growth of loneliness is actually amongst Gen Z and millennials. The youngest people among us are the most lonely. Okay, so we'll go in a little bit about why that is in just a moment. The other big factor that's been growing really over the last 40 years has been the explosive growth of the religious nuns, those who hold no religion whatsoever, those who check on a box that they hold no religion, right? And this has been growing really since the mid-'80s, and we're now at 29% of all Americans consider themselves to be religious nuns. What I'm here to tell you and share with you is that both of these phenomena are actually caused by the same singular root cause, okay? And unless the church becomes deeply interested in solving the problem at the root cause, we will not see true renewal, absent a miraculous intervention by the Holy Spirit, right? So that said, the root cause of all this is the collapse of resident fatherhood, which is caused by the collapse of marriage. Okay, that's at the root and branch of the rise of religious non-affiliation. It's at the heart of the explosive growth of loneliness in our country. And so what I want to do is prove that to you tonight. Those are sort of the key takeaway of the study. Now, this study is based on the findings of 19,000 completed surveys gathered from 112 different congregations on Sunday morning during worship, okay, spread across 13 different states. It's gathered from evangelical churches, different Protestant churches, as well as Catholic parishes, okay? And the findings are robust. I'll start to unpack them here for you. Just a moment before going into that. Let's call to mind that over the last decade, okay, if as you became an adult in this country, more than half of all new adults grew up in a home without a continuously married parent, okay? So the intact, married, biological family is an absolute minority in this country, has been for a decade, okay? So with that being the case, you would think that the church and the membership of church should look a little bit like that. It should look like the breakdown of our families today. And that couldn't be further from the case, okay? 80% of everybody in the pews on Sunday morning grew up in a home with continuously married parents. And that trend held across all age groups, okay? Down to the youngest groups, okay? In fact, 25 to 29-year-old never married men, as an example, 87% of them grew up in a home where mom and dad stayed continuously married. That means, right, 9 out of 10 of them sitting in the pews had married parents, okay? Now, about 3/5 of them actually do in the population, okay? So, I'm sorry, 2/5. Got my fractions inverted, okay? So this is a massive factor. When you look at this graph in front of you, I don't expect you to read everything here. Just look at the colors and look at the lines, and they're mostly about the same level, okay? It's blue are the men, red the women, okay? You've got never married and the currently married, okay? And the first going from the furthest left are 18 to 29-year-olds, then 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, okay? Of everybody sitting in the pews on Sunday, what you see is this homogeneity between everybody's family structure, okay? About 80% of them are growing up in a home where mom and dad stayed married. In fact, a never married man who's 21 is every bit as likely to have grown up in a home with married parents as a 59-year-old man who's married, right? Now, there's been a lot change to family. There's been a revolution in family structure over the last 60 years, right? So what's changed when pastors look at what's going on with the diminishing numbers in the pews, okay, what they're not frequently understanding is that what's driving it is the collapse of the family itself. That's the leading indicator, right? Churchgoers are categorically more likely to have grown up with a resident father in the home, okay? Now, not all, almost all resident dads are married dads, and generally if you're a resident dad over the long haul, you're a married dad, okay? This graph that I'm showing you now, okay, the dark blue line is non-marital births, and the teal line is the growth in divorce as measured by ever divorced women between the age of 50 and 54, okay? The red line, that red line is the religious nuns, okay? What you see is that the red line chases the teal and the blue line, okay, with about a 25-year time lag behind it, okay? So the effect of the collapse of the family is you start to see an explosive growth in religious non-affiliation. So why are dads the missing ingredient, right? Why am I pounding on this so significantly? I go into this in the study, and you can download the study for free online. You can go to communio.org/study right now if you want. But why I hit on this so significantly is there's a huge body of research that connects faith and religious practice to a child's relationship with his or her dad, okay? Oxford University Press published a study that was a longitudinal study covering 40 years, okay? And it followed 350 families with over 3,000 adults over that time frame. What they disproportionately found was that an adult's description of his or her relationship being warm and close with her dad was the biggest predictor of whether or not that adult practiced faith as an adult, right? And they did not see a similar relationship to motherhood and closeness to a warmth and closeness to the mom, okay? So the dad was hugely important. I cite other research in the study. I'll point out just one other piece from Dr. Paul Vitz, who's a former atheist. He's a professor of psychology. He was a professor of psychology at NYU. He's now a Christian. He has a peer-reviewed thesis that he's turned into a popular book called Faith of the Fatherless, which I commend to everybody here. And he looks at the world's 30 best-known atheists. And his basic thesis is that atheism and agnosticism is very frequently connected to a failure to attach to a dad. Okay? That whether it's Karl Marx or Friedrich Nietzsche, Madeleine Marie O'Hare, they all have this big thing in common. Even the new atheists today, Sam Harris and others, they have an absent or a broken relationship with dad. Now, a couple things. I'm going to go back here. A couple things. We all know dads who aren't married who are good dads. Okay? So I want you to understand when I'm using this data, I'm speaking in general and on average. Okay? So that's number one. And number two, we all know individuals, men and women have been falling away from the faith for centuries. Okay? And so some of you in this room may have adult children who have fallen away from active faith belief or faith practice, okay? And since the story of the prodigal son, there's been a number of reasons why. So what I'm using here is an appeal to statistical averages that we're seeing. So I want you to understand that. And then when we look at non-resident dads, okay, one of the best, perhaps the most frequently cited scholar on non-resident fathers and fatherhood is Dr. Paul Amato. And he looked at the patterns of non-resident fathers and looking at the very highest performing non-resident dads, the top 32%. Okay, even within this top group, they are not able to maintain more than once a week contact with their children within 2 to 3 years of separation. So this is it's a huge challenge for a dad who's not married to stay active in the life of his son or daughter, to disciple them, to form them in Christian faith. Now, what this all means is that fundamentally renewal, true renewal in this 21st century, right, fundamentally requires the recovery of Christian marriage. There's no path outside of it, right? Now, I will note here that the Holy Spirit can do whatever he wants, okay? He's not limited by the social science data that I'm sharing with you, okay? However, I will also note that biblically speaking, God tends to limit himself from time to time through his own sovereignty, right? He chose to come to us through a virgin at a moment in time in Bethlehem, right? He didn't need to, but he freely chose to, okay? The Bible is bookended with marriage in Genesis and in Revelation. Throughout the Old Testament and into the New Testament, God's love for his people is told as a spousal love story, okay, over and over again. Marriage, human marriage, is a sign of the divine love for mankind, right? And it's a sign of salvation. So while the Holy Spirit absolutely is sovereign and God can do whatever he wants, it would appear from the biblical data that he has made marriage central to his plan for salvation, is what I'm sharing with you tonight. So if we're able to recover marriage and Christian marriage, it'll also solve the loneliness epidemic, which I began this discussion with, right? There's this expanding and ever-growing loneliness. And it's with the youngest, the millennials and Gen Z. Well, these generations are also the least likely to be married, okay? When you peel back the data on loneliness within the church, okay, 22% of all Sunday churchgoers are considered lonely based on the public health definition. But when you pierce that back a little bit, there's more to the story. In fact, 15% of married people are considered lonely, while at least 50% of every single demographic is considered lonely. And when you dive into those numbers a little bit more, there's significant differences, okay? Perhaps those of you in this audience would believe that widows, it would make sense that widows And widowers are the loneliest group within the church. And what we found was surprising, that they aren't. Okay, the lonelier than the loneliest group of widows and widowers are 30 to 39-year-old men and women who have never married. They're lonelier than the loneliest group of widows. Okay, so what is fueling the loneliness epidemic is the flight from marriage. Okay, so if we can recover marriage, you'll solve the loneliness epidemic. Looking at this graph I'll share with you, the blue numbers are the never married, and in terms of their loneliness, being considered lonely by the public health definition. Okay, the red line is the considered loneliness levels of the married. Okay, there's a pretty big spread there. And it peaks, you see, in the 30s, 30 to 39. Now, if you think about it, for all of about 2 weeks in the span of human history, we've been getting married in our 30s, right? Like, this is a very new phenomenon, is what I'm saying, right? Before the year 2000, it was very unusual, right? Today, it's become average, right? The average age of marriage is 30, okay? And it shouldn't surprise us that this is actually, historically speaking, and given our own anthropology, it's actually historically not normal, right? And so what you're seeing showing up in the data, I think, is our reaction to something that we're not meant to be. We're not meant, right? In the book, in Genesis 2:18, it's not good for man to be alone. That's what you're seeing, I think, in this data right here. Okay, so men, never married men, 68% are considered lonely, and 64% of women are in that group. Now, we've also heard, I love Maria's setup here, right? Companionship is what modern, post-modernity, we're really in post-modernity now, what we crave. And we're told that marriage is just a piece of paper, right? Marriage is just a piece of paper. And the reality is that couldn't be further from the truth. I could cite you lots of data, but I'll just share with you this one piece of data, okay? If you're cohabiting, you're 85% more likely to report being considered lonely, being in the lonely category, okay? So about double. And not only are you lonelier, as we'll see, you're much less satisfied in your relationship. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As a church and as Christians, we absolutely need to be focused on marital health, okay? Marital health is critical for the health of the church. And 85% of all churches in America report spending $0 annually on marriage and relationship ministry, okay? 85%. Post a donut, okay? That to me actually gives me reason for great hope. It means that the family has been in free fall and the church has been sitting in the locker room, right? We're wondering why we're getting the score run up on us. It's like the Texas and OU game. I think a lot of folks at OU were thinking that their team didn't leave the locker room this season. But that's frequently what's going on in the case of the church. I have to put a jab into the new entrant into the Southeastern Conference here, being that I'm a Gator here. So that said, one in five Christians in the pews on Sunday report struggling in their marriage. Okay, we use a key question that's predictive of marital success to measure this. It's 18%, but when you pull that apart between gender, you see there's more to the story. Okay, women are 62% more likely to report struggling in their marriage than their husbands. Okay, and that maybe doesn't surprise any of the women here. I don't know. I'm just kidding. Okay, so as we look at that data, though, the red line is self-reported struggling in your marriage for women, and the blue line is self-reported struggling for men. Okay, the biggest gap is between married men and women in their 30s, and peak levels of struggling are in their 40s. Okay, based on our, and that's found in other and corroborated in other data sets as well. okay? When you look at this, women in their 30s being the biggest spread, you're 109% more likely to struggle in your marriage than your husband, okay? 109%. So it's a huge gap, and one of the ones that we're trying to educate pastors about. Okay, we have to normalize, make it normal to invest in your marriage, in your relationship, right? Marriage is the most common pathway to grow in holiness for most people, okay? And so the church should be coming alongside married people to help them grow in their holiness by loving one another better. And guess what? There's great skills that are known and knowable that have come up through research, intrapersonal skills, and the church can and should be a school of love, teaching those skills and equipping men and women, both as singles and as marrieds, to live healthy relationships well, right? Now, despite one of the big things here is, while we're unpacking a little bit of the married data, I want to note that married people in church are still the happiest Americans. In fact, Dr. Brad Wilcox from the University of Virginia is publishing a book this fall that's going to cite chapter and verse in all this, okay? It's important to know what's going on with our married people in church, and it's also important to take stock that on net, married churchgoers are more satisfied and happier in life and in their marriage than those who aren't. Now, when we compare married people to cohabitors, okay, you see a big gap, right? These are responses from cohabiting church-going Christians, okay? And you see that it's almost twice the likelihood of struggling in your relationship, okay? Women in particular, it's a really, cohabiting men are way more dissatisfied than married men, okay? And for cohabiting women, they are far more dissatisfied than both, okay? So cohabitation is fundamentally an unjust situation for women based on the data. They're lonelier, men and women are lonelier, and they're less satisfied in their relationship. All right, so maybe you guys have heard the expression, but you're too young to get married, right? Maria didn't listen to that. That's good. My wife and I were blessed to get married right after college as well, and this is a statement that's too frequently repeated by Christian church-going parents, okay? The church is not equipping parents, and the church is not preaching effectively and teaching effectively about marriage and how to form healthy relationships, okay? And when the church doesn't teach, it doesn't mean you're not being taught. I want to point out. When the church fails to teach, the world fills the vacuum. Okay, we don't want the world to fill the vacuum. It's mission critical for the church to speak into this. This is the phenomenon of capstone versus cornerstone marriage. Guys like Brad Wilcox and Mark Regnerus have written a lot about this, and others. Okay, if you've never heard of the term, you'll quickly understand what it means, right? When you're building a building, okay, you lay the cornerstone first. It's the most important stone that's laid. Now, capstone is the last stone laid. You put the capstone on top of the building when you're done with it, okay? Our society has shifted from a cornerstone view of marriage to a capstone view of marriage. And normally you would, when you're young and you're trying to figure out life, you're trying to find your way, you're trying to find a good job, scrape enough money to get by, you and someone else, if you're looking for your wife, you would go into mission, you would go on commission together, you would get married and build a life together. Okay, that was normal, that was cornerstone marriage. Okay, that has largely vanished. We've been told by the world, and frequently implied through parents, that no, go get a great job first, go amass, a lot more comfort in terms of your income, and maybe go see some things. You're too young, okay? And that leads to delays in marriage, and Mark Regnerus' data shows that when the average age in a nation's marriage goes up, the number of people who never marry also goes up. So we have to understand that when we encourage and give that message, we're actually trying to convince a number of people to never marry, because that's what the outcome will actually be, okay? And having, this is a key thing, there's a confusion that getting married young precludes you from having a happy and incredible marriage. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That those who get married young, certainly when we look at this data, Sunday churchgoers are doing, the percentages of marital satisfaction are high. Okay, you're talking about 82% of those in the pews report being very satisfied or more in their marriage, right? So now I want to double click on an item here, because this sometimes leads us to thinking about marriage. If we're being serious about increasing the number of people getting married, we actually have to get serious about the gender gap that exists in our pews. Okay, what we found is that gap is real, it's significant. Okay, of those who've never married, okay, there's 42% more women in the pews on Sunday than men. Okay, and mathematically speaking, if you want the marriage market to clear, right, you want people to find somebody, you need to have an even number, right, of men and women, right? And so we talk about, when we work and talk with pastors, is being very real with that gap, okay, and being creative about solving that gap. The pastor needs to own that, okay? The church needs to own that. How can we draw in young men into the life of the church, to a life of faith? Now, it's sometimes said, maybe you've heard the expression, that marriage civilizes men. I know Mrs. DeGance agrees with that, as she's listening right now. Marriage, if that's true, if marriage civilizes men, statistically speaking, it means that we've never lived at a time in our history where there's been more uncivilized men walking the streets of our communities, okay? And I know if you're looking at the news, I know that you can't help but nod your head and see that that happens to be the case, right? So I'd encourage you to go ahead and download the study, communio.org/study. There's also a way to get it through text study 23 to 42284. And you can download the study. It's free. I would encourage you to get it and share it with your pastor, with elders at your church. I would encourage you, if you've got a Bible study, a small group, I'd encourage you to read it together and ask the question of what can we do? What can my church do? What can I do? How can we champion a renewal and a recovery of Christian marriage? So thank you so much. And looking forward to getting some questions from you all.